Welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now, it's kind of late. It's now 9:10 p.m. in quite a dark Central Europe, but not as dark as it's going to be. So this is as I said before, the month that I get to enjoy because now we get the longish days until it all starts rapidly going downhill and into the misery of winter. So these are the pleasant days. Welcome everybody who has joined me for the Tuesday night live stream, and as I always like to put it, it's now 3:11 p.m. on the east coast of the United States, and President Trump has said very little about the rather shocking events over the weekend, um, namely the Ukrainian drone attack on the Russian strategic bombers. That's a very serious business, because obviously um, they are strategic bombers, and they are obviously something that are part and parcel of all of the various uh, arms control agreements that the United States and Russia have been negotiating and signing and ratifying ever since the first one, 1972. And now they were attacked, something the United States has never done. The United States have always shirked from doing anything at all to mess with Russia's strategic weapons. But now they were attacked. And they were attacked clearly with the use of American intelligence. So this is American intelligence as to the exact locations of these strategic bombers. That was something that was only known to American American intelligence as part of the New START Treaty. The New START Treaty, of course, has all the verification procedures in which the two parties exchange data, telemetry information, and they apprise each other as to the location of all of their strategic weapons, whether they're bombers, whether they're missiles, whether they're submarines. All of that, the information is disclosed to one another as part of the verification process. So Ukraine doesn't get this information. This is agreements between Russia and the United States. So how did Ukraine get this information? Very precise information. That's why they were able to hit these strategic bombers. It was obviously the United States that provided this information. So that's very serious. And of course, it's very serious that Trump has said nothing about this. Now, remember, last week, Trump had been shooting his mouth off, complaining that somehow Putin was, I don't know, going crazy. Remember, he had those tweets. He's going crazy. He's not, not listening to me. He's gone. I don't know what's the matter with him. It's just irrational. And then he sent out another truth saying that well, Putin doesn't realize that I am the only thing saving him from really nasty consequences. So he said all this in response to Russian missile and drone attacks on Ukraine last weekend. Not this weekend, but obviously the weekend before that. And when he was informed by a reporter at an impromptu news briefing that, this may have been a response to the Ukrainian drone attack on Putin's helicopter. Putin was visiting Kursk, and he suddenly came under his helicopter came under a drone attack. And Trump seemed genuinely surprised by this information. And but nonetheless, this didn't stop him from 2 days later sending out that ridiculous truth, saying that, well, I'm all that, Putin doesn't seem to realize that I'm what saves him from all kinds of really bad things. So he was threatening these really bad things, and we talked about this last week and wondered, well, what does he mean by really bad things? What what do you have in mind? Maybe this is what we have. I don't know. But Trump hasn't said anything. And this would be a much more of a relevant thing for him to address, because let's remember, that was simply Russia attacking Ukraine. You may not like it, whatever, but it's still between Russia and Ukraine. It doesn't really affect the United States directly. So he just expressed his annoyance because Trump, is trying to do whatever, trying to bring this war to an end, and Putin is ignoring his scriptures. But this time, it's entirely important for him to address this particular issue, because first of all, it's an attack on Russian strategic weapons. Therefore, it's something that affects the United States. It's done by using information provided, obviously, by the United States. They couldn't possibly have done it without information. Therefore, that affects the United States. And of course, the important issue is clearly the one that no one seems to want to ask is, well, did Trump, the White House, the Pentagon, CIA, Tulsi Gabbard at the ODNI, did they know about this in advance? If they didn't know about this in advance, well, what does that say about the relationship with Zelensky? Does Zelensky just get to do these kinds of things, really dangerous things, that could absolutely provoke a nuclear war between Russia and the United States? Does Zelensky just get to do it without consulting his patrons? Either way, the implications are quite serious, and Trump has nothing to say. That's not a good look. And it's not a good look when Lindsey Graham was in Ukraine during the weekend, along with Blumenthal, and he was clearly egging on Zelensky. They were both egging him on and making clear to Zelensky that Graham, will soon be introducing the sanctions bill in the Senate, and then he's got all the votes. He has a veto-proof majority. That's his claim. And then Lindsey Graham, continued with his travels across Europe, talking to Ursula von der Leyen. They issued a joint statement yesterday, lip-smackingly relishing the upcoming sanctions, the 18th round on the part of the EU, and then, of course, this enormous sanctions bill that Graham is going to introduce, whereby all purchases of Russian oil and gas will be hit, on all their, the countries that are purchasers of these Russian oil and gas, their exports to the United States will be hit with 500% tariffs. So in other words, he's hitting India, China, and saying that their exports to the United States will be hit with 500% tariffs. As I pointed out, amazing the transformation, amazing how we were told that Trump's tariffs, We're going to bring the world economy to its knees. There was going to be global recession, depression, inflation, stagflation, all these horrors that would be rained down on the world economy because of Trump's tariffs. But suddenly, this 500% tariff, 500%, which is a lot more than Trump was threatening, 500% tariffs against China and our good friend India. India is supposed to be an American ally. 500%. Everyone's, hey, fantastic, great. Well, what happened to the world economy? I mean, I thought it was going to come crashing down. I thought, we'd soon have starvation in the streets because of tariffs. The shelves would be empty. There'll be nothing. There'll be nothing for Christmas. Now, but apparently 500% tariffs. And what about our ally? Aren't we supposed to? We can't hurt our ally. India. A good friend India. We're going to hit them with a 500% tariffs. But amazing. It just shows the lack of any kind of intellectual honesty, any sort of principle at all in the media. We just from one day to the next. Oh my God, the world economy. Oh, 500% tariffs. Great. That'll show Putin. But anyway, Lindsey Graham's going around saying all of this and purporting to speak on behalf of the United States. So he's now essentially, presenting himself as the man who conducts U.S. foreign policy. I mean, he's just going around meeting all these dignitaries. After he met Ursula von der Leyen, he met the new German foreign minister. Again, they both issued a statement. And again, he's making clear that these sanctions are coming, and that he's going to introduce them. And Trump, he could try to veto them, but Graham, will have the last say. Well, that's a kind of very worrying, because Trump is the elected president. The foreign policy is entirely the president's bailiwick, and so he can't possibly cede this to Lindsey Graham. But the Europeans, who hate Trump and they want to see the back of Trump, are of course gleeful. And that's why they're welcoming Lindsey Graham with open arms and issuing all these statements with him. And then you get these pansies on CNN talking with their English accents. They're all very English accents. So, Lindsey Graham, I'm very heartened by Lindsey Graham. Heartened. I'm heartened by Lindsey Graham. Yes. I think he's introducing very important sanctions. I think it's going to rectify the situation. So Trump has just allowed this to happen. He has allowed Lindsey Graham to go around and present himself as the man who's dictating U.S. foreign policy. He said nothing about this attack on these strategic bombers. He has said nothing about America's involvement with this, who in the government was involved, if they weren't involved, and Zelensky just did it of his own. Well, what does it say about his authority? I mean, last week we were talking about how Trump is cracking down on Bibi Netanyahu. He's telling Netanyahu, "Hey, you got to get with the program." We're negotiating with Iran over its nuclear capabilities, and we don't appreciate Netanyahu threatening to bomb Iran while we're conducting these negotiations. So if you're Netanyahu, and you see the way Zelensky just showed the back of his hand to Trump, launching this attack, a very dangerous thing, much more dangerous, incidentally, than anything that Netanyahu is planning on Iran. like with Iran, we don't know what how capable Israel is of hitting anything substantial in Iran, whether he's capable of destroying Iran's nuclear reactors, or whether he's even capable of defeating Iran's air defenses, and whether Israel would be able to withstand any possible retaliation from Iran. We don't know. Those are all questions that are up in the air. But this isn't up in the air. This was these strategic bombers covered by arms control agreements, something that no American administration would have dared to mess around with. And Zelensky has done this, and Trump has said nothing, and no one seems to be asking him what was the level of American involvement in this. So that's one thing. Again, Trump's silence. If he allows this to continue, he will have completely lost control of his foreign policy, which is what happened during his first term. I mean, it's easy now to forget just how much he lost during his first term when he had an agenda, which was to improve relations with Russia. He ran on that platform, and clearly during the early days of his term, he seemed to be moving forward with that. He had Lavrov and the Russian ambassador Kislyak in the Oval Office, and they had that friendly conversation. And so he was moving in that direction. And then, of course, Russiagate swept him aside, and he agreed to the various sanctions that were agreed to impose a variety of sanctions on Russia, and particularly on the issue of alleged Russian interference in the 2016 election, something that he denied. So he was imposing sanctions on Russia for a supposed crime that Trump actually denied. Trump denied that Russia had interfered in the 2016 election. Of course, he would deny it, because that would undermine his legitimacy. So he said he insisted on this repeatedly. There's no evidence of Russian interference. And you remember when he was at Helsinki in 2018, again, the summit, there was a summit, and Putin proposed at Helsinki, look, I mean, you're claiming that we interfered in your election. Okay, well, let our intelligence people meet with your intelligence people. Let's present the evidence, and then we'll see what we've got, and we can come to some kind of a consensus on what really happened. Now, this, of course, is eminently reasonable and entirely in keeping with the work of intelligence services. And of course, there was absolute howling from the media, from policymakers. We can't possibly sit down with the Russians. The Russians are going to steal all this intelligence from us, and so on and so forth. So they never sat down. But of course, they never sat down because they had no evidence. There was no evidence of Russian interference, and it never happened. But Trump said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, which it was. Put up or shut up, present to the Russians your evidence for their interference. But you see, he was pushed aside from the policy he wanted to pursue, and instead he went down this path of imposing sanctions over Russian interference, and then even harsher sanctions over the nonsense that the British cooked up over the Skripals. Trump, against his will, expelled 60 Russian diplomats from the United States, including, incidentally, Russian diplomats assigned to the United Nations, which the United States doesn't have any jurisdiction over, because that's independent. United Nations is independent from the U.S. government. So he was thrown off track. This could happen because right now he's made to look a right Charlie by Lindsey Graham. I mean, he's going around speaking on behalf of the United States. I mean, how does a senator from South Carolina, who is not very popular in his own state, get to speak on behalf of the president? You have to think any other president would not have tolerated this. Nixon would not have tolerated this. Lyndon Johnson would not have tolerated this. I don't even think George W. Bush would have tolerated this. Trump has. Not only that, Lindsey Graham was mocking. He was mocking Trump because he was saying something like, I can't remember the exact phrasing. Is that people are saying that Ukraine doesn't have too many cards to play. Well, Ukraine has shown he's got a lot of cards to play. Who said Ukraine doesn't have many cards to play? Trump. It was Trump who said this. So Lindsey Graham was out there in Europe meeting all these empty-headed EU worthies, and he was mocking Trump. You say Ukraine doesn't have too many cards to play. Ukraine has a lot of cards to play. So, this could unravel very quickly for Trump. And then suddenly he's no longer in any way that he's in control of his foreign policy. Because, as I say, I think Netanyahu is watching this and is thinking, hey, I mean, if Zelensky can do it, and in taking much greater risks than I would by attacking Iran. I mean, Iran is, basically a third-rate, if that, power. I can attack a third-rate power without worrying too much. And while Trump doesn't seem to have anything to say on attacking a nuclear superpower. So yeah, absolutely. If you're Netanyahu saying, yeah, I'm ready, I'm down. So that's one aspect of it. Now the other aspect of it is, there's been a lot of nonsense talked over the past couple of days over this, so that Russia was somehow obligated to keep its strategic bombers out in the open, out on the open airfields, because according to the New START treaty, all strategic aircraft must be visible at all times, and that Russia could not hide these aircraft in hangars because they had to be visible at all times. This is absolute nonsense, total, unadulterated nonsense. First of all, the most obvious thing is that, well, let me think now. Didn't we go through the 2023 announcement by Russia that it was would no longer participate in the New START treaty? I mean, wasn't that the part of the saber rattling? Russia was engaging in saber rattling, and he said we're not going to. He said we will observe. Putin said we will observe the limits on our on the missiles, on our carriers, on our warheads. We will observe those limits, but we will not participate in the treaty. In other words, we're not going to have inspections anymore because, obviously, we don't trust the Americans. That's why we're not going to have any more inspections. Very, very reasonable. And then the Americans did likewise. And America said, "Well, if you're not participating, we're not participating. We're not going to allow you to inspect our nuclear capabilities." So that was Russia's position. It was that, in other words, if you have no inspections, because we don't trust the Americans, therefore already there's no obligation whatever to allow, to leave anything out there to be observed by satellites. There's none. You've already said you're not participating in it. Now that's one obvious point. The second obvious point is that was never it was never part of any arms control agreement. Neither the original START agreement or the new START agreement was never part of any agreement that all strategic aircraft have to be out in the open at all times for satellite inspection, for an obvious reason. I mean, because there are many times when you have to bring your aircraft indoors, for reasons of service, reasons of maintenance, reasons of protection from the weather. You can't just keep everything out in the open. I mean, you need work on it, because of course, what was supposed to be there for satellite inspection were the aircraft or the launchers that were either dismantled or destroyed, and so then you had to present evidence of its being dismantled or destroyed, or if nuclear capable aircraft was being changed into non-nuclear capable aircraft. So that was the point. It was that, the reason for the satellite. It's not that you have to all times you have to watch the every single thing that you've got. It's more that the satellites need to discern any the fulfillment of the agreement. So you actually are going to fulfill the terms of the agreement, namely that you're dismantling nuclear missiles, you're dismantling nuclear capable aircraft, anything, nuclear launches, whatever, that you have to then show that you have actually done it. So there was the idea that there was you're supposed to be out in the open is completely nonsensical. Unfortunately, one would have to say, that this was a major failure on the part of the Russians. They had ample warning that Ukraine was going to do this. Remember, Ukraine has already attacked the strategic aircraft in the airfields before, but that was also we're using drones, but it wasn't quite in the way they did it now. I mean, that was a long distance drones. So they didn't really do much damage. In this case, I think they did far more damage, and it wasn't from a long distance. There was the drones were launched from a very short distance deep inside Russia. So the fact was, obviously, the Russians had every reason to fear that Ukraine would launch such an attack, and hadn't done anything to harden these sites, these airfields, and hadn't done anything to make sure that these aircraft are in hangars, so they can't actually be targeted with such ease. So again, the Russian apologists are telling us, well, it was, we're too good for this world. We're adhering to this New START treaty, and that's why we were just too trusting. No, it was never part of the New START treaty, because it just, again, you think about it in common sense. Of course, you can't be out in the open at all times. And so yeah, this was indeed quite humiliating. Um, so that was that. Now the other thing is the actual negotiations um, were quite interesting. So if we just looked at the proposals that were presented at in Istanbul yesterday. The meeting itself lasted all of about 1 hour, and then they did the usual thing. Oh, we're going to have exchanges of prisoners of war. We're going to exchange bodies, and the Russians offered 2 or 3 day ceasefire so that bodies can be collected and then they can exchange bodies. As I've said before, the prisoner of war thing just seems completely absurd. The exchanges of prisoners of war take place at the end of a war for one obvious reason. When you're a prisoner of war, you are still under the command of your commanding officers. Those are the rules of war. You're still under military command. And so when an exchange of prisoners of war takes place, then all the prisoners of war forsake the safety and comfort of a prisoner of war camp in favor of reporting back to their commanding officers. That's their obligation. They have to report back to their commanding officers immediately. Not, oh, can I go home and get a cup of tea first? No, you have to report back to your commanding officer. And then when you report back to your commanding officer, you are sent back to the front. That's the prisoner of war. You're sent back to the front. You're still, under command. You're still an active duty soldier, and you have no excuse for taking any time off. In fact, there's always a disapproval, but you've been having a good time, relaxing, in a prisoner of war camp instead of fighting. And so, you get immediately sent back to the front. So there's nothing humane about this. You're going from one thing where, you're actually, okay, at least, you're in a prisoner of war camp. It's no fun. Obviously, being a prisoner anywhere is no fun. But at least you're safe. You're away from the fighting. You're getting, 3 meals a day. Not terribly good food, but at least you're getting 3 meals a day. You're sleeping in your bed. So you're swapping that with being sent back to the front. And of course, as prisoners of war in the past have been treated with contempt by their own commanders because they'd surrendered. You're not supposed to surrender. You're given, you're given a weapon, and you're supposed to use your weapon. You're not supposed to give up your weapon. It's contemptible to give up your weapon. I mean, that was the view of Stalin, which is why when the prisoners of war were given return to the Soviet Union, they were all regarded as traitors. They hadn't actually betrayed their country. They just simply had surrendered. And therefore, so as soon as they were released from captivity, they were handed over to the Soviets, and they sent straight to Siberia. You've got, you spent a few years in captivity. Now you're going to spend a few more years in captivity as your punishment for having surrendered your weapons. And so it's very strange. I mean, if you remember, I don't know people who have watched the Bridge on the River Kwai, You remember how the Japanese officer, the Japanese colonel, was treating these British prisoners of war with contempt, and he said, "Well, they have to do manual work." And there was Colonel Nicholson, played brilliantly by Alec Guinness, who was saying, "Well, Geneva Conventions, officers do not do manual labor." To which, I think, was it Colonel Saito? That was the commanding officer. Colonel Saito said, "You are not an officer anymore. You are a coolie. When you surrendered, you ceased to be an officer. Therefore, you have to go work." But so that was, I mean, of course, that was a violation of the Geneva Conventions. Nonetheless, I mean, that was still a way to, soldiers looked upon prisoners of war. I mean, I'm certainly not criticizing anyone for surrendering, but you can also see the logic of somebody like Colonel Saito, or the logic of Stalin, which says you're not supposed to surrender under any circumstances. And then if you do, then you get punished. So, but in any case, I mean, exchanges of prisoners of war means, hey, at least we're dealing with our manpower shortage problem. We got these soldiers; they've been in prison. Now they can be sent to the front, so we'll address the manpower shortage, which is again puzzling, for the obvious reason that we hear from the Russian side, and all Russia's apologists and champions or whatever, who tell us that Ukraine has a serious manpower shortage, and I guess it does have a serious manpower shortage, but seems to be coping with that manpower shortage fine. I mean, it had a manpower shortage 3 years ago, but anyway, they say, well, there's a serious manpower shortage. So what's the logic then of providing additional manpower to Ukraine? I mean, you're just giving them manpower. Here's a few thousand fit young men whom you can send to the front, tomorrow or next week. It doesn't seem to make much sense. I mean, if you are fighting this war of attrition, which is what we're told, well, Russia's fighting this war of attrition. Ultimately, Ukraine just doesn't have the manpower to go on fighting this war of attrition. But if you are fighting, if that's your strategy to fight and win a war of attrition, then I don't understand the logic of handing over thousands of prisoners of war, which is going to help your manpower shortage problem. So that seems to be an obvious contradiction between the war of attrition and providing Ukraine with additional manpower. So but that's part of this sort of this thing. The only thing they've actually come to any kind of agreement on in these Istanbul talks is this exchange of prisoners of war. So that was it. Now, in terms of what the both sides presented, they're pretty much their standard, principles. That it's exactly what you would expect Ukraine to present, and it's exactly what you would think the Russians would present. Now, if we're going to take a look at this, what they've offered, but in principle, I can see a energetic, ambitious, imaginative American president using these two sets of ideas, however incompatible, to come to some kind of a deal. It can be done. But with Trump seemingly AWOL, then it's not going to be done. So if you just let's take a look at first what the Ukrainians put forward. And here we have the full and unconditional ceasefire on sky, land, and sea as a necessary background and prerequisite for peace negotiations. All right, so that's their demand as a prerequisite for peace negotiations. Now, Russia has obviously said no to this. However, and as we'll come to it in a minute, Russia, in principle, is prepared to accept a full and unconditional ceasefire for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever, full and unconditional ceasefire, as long as NATO and the NATO powers do not deliver any weapons to Ukraine and do not provide Ukraine with any intelligence. In other words, during this 30, 60, 90 days ceasefire, Ukraine is not to enjoy the benefits of rearmament. That's what the Russians said that in their proposal. So again, as I said, if there's an imaginative leadership in Washington, they'll say, okay, well, let's, Ukraine says we need a full and unconditional ceasefire as a precondition for the beginning of peace negotiations. And I said, okay, we will have a full and unconditional ceasefire as a precondition of peace negotiation, and we are not going to provide Ukraine with any arms or intelligence. So that can be done if there was a will to do it. And now then he goes, confidence building measures addressing humanitarian issues, unconditionally return all deported and illegally displaced Ukrainian children, exchange of all prisoners, the all for all principle, released by Russia of all civilian hostages. Again, as I said, I mean, this stuff has to be, put it at the end. I mean, that's after you have the peace treaty, then you start, or a peace agreement, then you don't necessarily have to have a peace treaty, but a peace agreement, then you release your prisoners of war. Non-repetition of aggression. The aim of the negotiations is to restore a permanent basis for lasting peace and security, and to ensure that aggression does not occur again. And then security guarantees and engagement of the international community. Ukraine must receive robust security guarantees. Okay, well, that's non-starter as far as the Russians goes. The parties will invite the international community to participate in the negotiations and provide guarantees to ensure the implementation of the agreement. But then, keep in mind that was a part of the Istanbul agreement, which about the security guarantees, because they did agree on security guarantee. Russia was willing to agree as long as the guarantees, the guarantors included the Western powers, Russia, maybe I think China, Turkey, and they all had to agree. All of the guarantors had to agree that an act of aggression had taken place. Now, naturally, all the the gas bags, the Ukraine supporters, we can't have Russia acting as one of the guarantors. But if Russia doesn't act as one of the guarantors, then there's no way that you can get any kind of an agreement on security guarantees, because then what would happen is that Ukraine, along with its NATO powers, its NATO enablers, will declare anything to be, Russia has violated the agreement. Therefore, we security guarantors must do what we can to help Ukraine because Russia has violated the agreement. They would do that 2 days after the implementation of any peace agreement. The NATO powers in Ukraine will declare, Russia is already in violation of the agreement. We need to provide assistance to Ukraine. Of course, that's what they would do. So that's why Russia said, well, you have to have all of the guarantors have to be in agreement on whether a violation of the agreement has taken place. And yet this perfectly reasonable point was attacked by all this sort of Michael Tracy types. Oh, of course, how can you possibly have Russia as one of the guarantors? But that's the key. That's the absolute key. Russia has to be one of the guarantors. Russia launched this war precisely because Russia felt insecure. Russia felt that NATO, with Ukraine, was planning an aggressive war against Russia. So Russia has to be involved as one of the guarantors. That was in the Istanbul Agreement, and which they came close to agreeing to. So there shouldn't be a wholly insuperable obstacle to getting somewhere with this issue of the security guarantors. If you're going to exclude Russia as one of the security guarantors, then you don't have an agreement. It's as simple as that. You don't have an agreement. Now let's go on. And then guarantees sovereignty. Ukraine is not forced to be neutral. It can choose to be part of the Euro-Atlantic community and move toward EU membership. Ukraine's membership in NATO depends on consensus within the alliance. You can work around this because ultimately, NATO membership is just simply not on the cards. I mean, there's just too many. I mean, even Poland, with this new president, even Poland is unenthusiastic about having Ukraine in NATO. So there's just simply no, other than the Baltic states and Britain and maybe France and Germany, there's just simply, and I don't even think the Germans would go for it. So there's just a handful of NATO states that support the idea of Ukraine in NATO. So that's not going to happen. The Trump administration has already ruled it out. And I think any American president, even after Trump, would say no, because that would commit America into a world war. Not a good idea. EU membership, fine. I mean, you want to go towards EU membership. There's not going to be a consensus within the EU on having Ukraine in there anytime soon. So here, the Ukraine's membership in NATO depends on consensus within the alliance. So it accepts that you need the consensus within the alliance, something that isn't there, and then sure, pursue EU membership. I mean, Russia's never really raised objections to EU membership, but it's just not feasible. But the next part, I think, is a non-starter. No restrictions may be imposed on the number, deployment, or other parameters of the armed forces of Ukraine, as well as on the deployment of troops of friendly foreign states on the territory of Ukraine. There's no way that's not acceptable, because Russia has made clear that if you bring in NATO forces on the territory of Ukraine, then in effect, Ukraine is a member of NATO by any other name. It becomes de facto a member of NATO. So that's simply a non-starter. Territorial issue. Territorial gains made by Russia since February 2014 are not recognized by the international community. The contact line is the starting point for negotiation. Territory issues are to be discussed, and only after a full and unconditional ceasefire. Yeah, well, that also by itself would not be acceptable, because you can certainly say, look, no, you have to be realistic. No one's going to accept the oblasts, the four oblasts, or even Crimea as part of the Russian Federation. They're not going to accept it. The question then is, Ukraine would have to commit itself never to use any force to try to get back any territory it's lost. I mean, you'd have to say that would be the minimum, which is you can't use force to get it back. You don't have to accept it. You don't have to accept the territorial loss. You can say the territory is up for negotiations, but you will not try to change the situation on the ground um, through the use of force. So that would have to be absolutely have to be in any agreement, because otherwise it is just Minsk III, waiting for the next round of fighting. And then it goes on, and it says some sanctions may be lifted from Russia, but in stages and only gradually, with a mechanism for resuming sanctions if necessary, snap back. Well, we know exactly, if you have any kind of a sanctions policy, the snapback will go into effect immediately. It's just like 48 hours, boom, snap back. Frozen Russian sovereign assets are used for reconstruction or remain frozen until reparations are paid. Russia's not going to pay any reparations. And the issue of using sovereign, Russia's certainly not going to agree to the use of its sovereign assets to be used for reconstruction. But there's no real consensus within the EU on using Russia's sovereign assets for things that Russia doesn't agree to. I mean, that's obviously a violation of international law, and the Europeans that want to make sure that rich people park their money in Europe, buy property in London and Paris, and park their money in the lucrative Luxembourg banks. They're not going to do that if anyone suspects that their money can be seized and used for purposes that they don't agree to. So that's why there's just, however much they've been talking about this for 3 years, they still haven't agreed on using these sovereign assets for ends that Russia clearly would not approve of. And then implementation, agree on a clear, balanced, and achievable roadmap for implementation and enforcement of the agreements. And then agreeing ceasefire, agenda of the leaders' meeting. After the meeting in Istanbul, the parties continue the talks, which shall focus on one, full and unconditional ceasefire, its modalities and monitoring, confidence-building measures, preparation, agreeing agenda, structural, blah, blah. So, and then negotiations to be held with the US and Europe participating. And then full and unconditional ceasefire on land, sea, and air, 30 days, with the possibility of rolling extensions every 30 days. And then ceasefire monitoring led by the US and supported by third countries. You could probably work around that. I'm not sure about led by the US. I don't think it'll be acceptable. But you could probably have a mixture of countries that could be tasked with ceasefire monitoring. And then more of this confidence-building measure, after successful exchange of POWs. After the Istanbul talks, the parties continue the exchange process for all prisoners of war. And then agreement on unconditional return by the Russian Federation of all deported and displaced Ukrainian children, release by Russians of all civilian prisoners. These measures should include all categories of persons listed starting from February 2014. Again, none of this should be too much of a problem. Then leaders meeting. The leaders of the Ukraine and Russia meet to agree on key aspects of a final peace settlement. Key topics of peace agreement to be agreed by the leaders. 1, permanent and complete cessation of hostilities. Conditions, monitoring, sanctions for violations, security guarantees, and non-repetition of aggression, territorial issues, economy, compensation, reconstruction, penalties for breach of agreements, conclusion of a final peace agreement. And then, all right, so let me just go back. Now, when you look at that, yes, it sounds like a kind of a wish list for Ukraine. At the same time, there are things there that you can work with. Um, because ultimately NATO membership, EU membership are just not on the cards now. Um, the territorial issues, you'd have to say, Ukraine will make no. You'd have to have a commitment. Ukraine will make no effort to use force to recapture any territory it's lost. It would have to make a commitment like that. But there's nothing in there saying we demand all that territory to be returned to us. They haven't said that. And now the issue of the presence of foreign military forces, yeah, that's a non-starter. You're not going to have. Russia's not going to accept NATO forces stationed in Ukraine. So that's that, and then of course there's also the issue of the frozen assets. Clearly, that's a non-starter. Russia will not agree to the use of these frozen assets, its sovereign assets, to give it to Ukraine to have them. But it shouldn't be too much of a problem because the NATO member states are themselves not really pushing for that because they know it's a violation of international law, and they're going to be stuck in law courts for decades if they go down this path, and they will lose their reputation as a safe haven for funds. So it isn't going to happen. Now, let's take a look at what the Russian proposal was. That this was what the Russians presented. This is from TASS. Ukraine's neutrality, recognition of Donbass, Novorossiya, key ideas of Russian memorandum. And then it says, the Russian memorandum on a future settlement handed over to the Ukrainian delegation at the negotiations in Istanbul implies Ukraine's neutrality and a ban on any military activity by third country on its territory. Russia's proposal, set out in the document obtained by TASS, envisage elections in Ukraine followed by the signing of a peace treaty. So it says the first section of the document contains the basic parameters of the final settlement. The second section of the document, devoted to the terms of the ceasefire, contains two scenarios. The events might follow, and the third section establishes the sequence of steps and the deadlines for their implementation. This business of the two scenarios, that's very important. We'll come to that because that provides a possibility for some kind of a meeting ground between these two plans. So the terms of the settlement, as part of the ceasefire option, Kiev is offered to sign an agreement to implement the provisions of a final settlement. The document implies international recognition of Crimea, Donbass, and Novorossiya as part of Russia. Well, that's a non-starter. You just have to be honest. There will be no international recognition of Crimea, Donbass, and Novorossiya. It's just not going to happen. Not only will America not agree to it, the Europeans will not agree to it, China won't agree to it, India won't agree to it. I mean, it's just no one's going to agree to it. Maybe Nicaragua and Venezuela will agree to it, but there's not going to be international recognition. So that's just pointless. For a final settlement in Ukraine, it is crucial to ensure the full rights, freedoms, and interests of Russian speakers. Okay, that would have to be enshrined in the new Ukraine constitution. In principle, possible. This includes, but it's possible, but you'd have to absolutely push the Ukrainians to agree to this, because there's obviously going to be huge opposition within Ukraine to making that kind of a concession. It says this includes granting Russian the status of an official language. Again, there's going to be a huge fight about this. I mean, remember, Yanukovych in after he returned to power in 2010, changed the law and then said that in those parts of the country where Russian speakers comprised more than 17% of the population, Russian will become an official language. Just in those parts of the country. In other words, just in those oblasts where the Russians, I think it was 17%. If the Russian speakers were more than 17% of the population, Russian will become an official language. That law caused huge rage and opposition within Ukraine. So much so that, following the 2014 coup, that was the first piece of legislation that they enacted, was the cancellation of this law, and said nowhere, in no part of Ukraine will Russian be an official language, which was always rather ridiculous because all Ukrainians speak Russian. And it was just completely absurd, but it's an unfortunate feature of the Soviet Union and the clownish Yeltsin, who gave away the store at Belovej in December 1991. He didn't insist that Russian will become an official language. I think pretty much in all parts of the Soviet Union, Russian was official language everywhere in the Soviet Union. But instead, following the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russian was only recognized an official language in Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Only in those three former Soviet republics. It's just so ridiculous. After all these years that the Russian was the official language throughout the Soviet Union, three of the successor states was Russian recognized as an official language. Anyway, so that's going to be a hard sell in Ukraine to make Russian an official language. So granting Russian the status of an official language and a legislative ban on the glorification and propaganda of Nazism and neo-Nazism. Also, for a settlement in Ukraine, it is necessary to remove all restrictions on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The memorandum implies Ukraine's neutrality, which means its pledge not to join military alliances and coalitions. As I said, Ukraine said, "Oh no, we insist on our freedom to do so." But it isn't going to happen. I mean, NATO made that commitment in 2008, and so now, it's an interesting question. What the Russians insist upon, that Ukraine change its constitution, remove the references to aspiration to NATO and EU membership, or would they also insist on NATO rescinding its commitment in Bucharest in 2008, which has been repeated in every single NATO summit since then. Since 2008, Ukraine and Georgia will be members of NATO. So, I think Russia should insist on both: change the Ukraine constitution and demand that NATO rescind its promise of NATO membership to Ukraine. And then pledge not to join military alliances and coalitions, a ban on any military activity by third countries on the territory of Ukraine, and on the deployment of foreign military forces, military bases, and military infrastructure there. So obviously, that's a key Russian demand. and it had more or less been agreed to in Istanbul. So there's nothing too sensational about it. It had been agreed to in Istanbul in 2022. There is a direct ban on the acceptance, transit, and deployment of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. That shouldn't be too much of a problem. Ukraine had made a commitment to be nuclear free in its Declaration of State Sovereignty in 1990. So that's absolutely, within what the commitments that Ukraine had made. The document provides for the establishment of caps on the strength of the armed forces, weapons, and military equipment, which was, again, that was part of the Istanbul Agreement of 2022. It provides for the lifting of all existing sanctions by Ukraine against Russia and the mandatory pledge not to impose new ones. The document implies the waiver of mutual claims with Ukraine in connection with damage caused by hostility. So that bangos the whole thing about the use of the sovereign assets. And then the document provides for the phased restoration of diplomatic and economic relations with Ukraine, including gas transit, one ceasefire option for this is the important now. One ceasefire option. So remember, we have Ukraine and NATO and the United States demanding this 30-day ceasefire, unconditional 30-day ceasefire. Russia has said, Russia has said two things about the ceasefire. Remember, in June 2024, Putin has said, yeah, you can have a ceasefire if you withdraw all of your forces from the four oblasts, which is Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, and you forswear membership of NATO, that you have no intention of joining any military alliance, you can have your ceasefire. That's what he said in June 2024. But now he's saying, well, you can have a ceasefire as long as you get no arms from abroad, that as long as NATO is not providing you with any arms and not providing you with any intelligence. So that's the two options for the ceasefire that Russia is offering. So one ceasefire option for Kiev is the complete withdrawal of all Ukrainian army from the DPR, LPR, and the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. From the moment the Ukrainian military begins to withdraw from the territory of Russia, including Donbass and Novorossiya, a 30-day ceasefire will be established. The withdrawal must be completed within 30 days of the ceasefire. Within 30 days of the ceasefire. Okay, so from the moment the Ukrainian military begins to withdraw from the territory of Russia, a 30 days. Okay, so the moment they begin withdrawing, the ceasefire goes into effect, and that means the withdrawal must be completed within that 30-day ceasefire period. Okay, the other option for a ceasefire for Kiev involves a package of 10 points. A ceasefire in Ukraine, in particular, implies a ban on the redeployment of the Ukrainian armed forces. In other words, you can't start moving your forces around. Everyone stays in place during the ceasefire, with the exception of movements for withdrawal to an agreed distance from the borders of Russia. And then for the ceasefire, all Western arms supplies to Ukraine shall be halted. The same applies to the provision of intelligence data. So this is the second option. It's very important to keep this in mind, particularly when the media keep repeating ad nauseum, Russia doesn't agree to a ceasefire. They do agree to a ceasefire. They presented two possible scenarios for a ceasefire. Either Ukraine begins the withdrawal from the territories of the Donbass, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, and it completes the withdrawal from those territories. So that this is, this actually isn't as stringent a demand as the Putin's demand in June of 2024, because then he said, well, you withdraw your forces and you forswear membership of any military alliance. Here, he's not asking at this stage anyway for to forswear military alliance. He said, if you begin the withdrawal from these four oblasts, then the ceasefire goes into effect. So that's one possibility. You begin the withdrawal, the ceasefire goes into effect. The second is if you can have a ceasefire if you agree not to redeploy your forces. In other words, all your forces staying put, and there has to be no arms flow or intelligence going to Ukraine. So that's just something very important to remember, because the media are just lying all the time, saying, "Oh, Putin is saying no to a ceasefire." Putin has actually presented two different scenarios for acceptance of a ceasefire. And here we have we go back to the document. And then, ceasefire in particular implies a ban on the redeployment of Ukrainian armed forces, with the exception of movements for withdrawal to an agreed distance from the borders of Russia. For the ceasefire, all Western arms supplies to Ukraine shall be halted. The same applies to the provision of intelligence data. And then the military presence of third countries on the territory of Ukraine must be excluded. That was the one that Keir Starmer and Macron were talking. Yeah, we're ready to send our troops in the moment the ceasefire goes into effect. Yeah, we're ready. We're ready to send them. Ready to go. And they said, no, you don't. There's been no military presence of third countries on the territory of Ukraine. The ceasefire in Ukraine implies the cancellation of martial law in Kiev. So therefore, if there's to be a ceasefire, then martial law ends, and then they say a bilateral center for monitoring and controlling the ceasefire is to be established. In addition, mobilization is to be halted and demobilization begun in Ukraine in order to achieve a ceasefire. Okay, so exactly. I mean, obviously, there's not going to be any mobilization during the time of the ceasefire. And then furthermore, the document calls for the dissolution of nationalist formations in Ukraine. Kiev must grant amnesty to political prisoners and release detained military personnel and civilians. And then terms and procedure for signing the peace treaty in the third section of the document, which establishes the sequence of steps and the deadlines for their implementation immediately after Russia transfers 6,000 bodies of deceased military personnel to Ukraine. So that's what they're going through now, 6,000 for 6,000 dead bodies. There will be the signing of a memorandum on a ceasefire with specific dates for the implementation of all its provisions and the determination of the date for the signing of a future treaty on a final settlement. That done, a 30-day ceasefire shall be established. And then next comes the holding of elections, the formation of authorities on the territory of Ukraine, followed by the signing of the treaty. So this is the familiar point the Russians have been making, that there has to be an election, there has to be some legitimacy to the president of Ukraine who puts his signature to the treaty. The Ukrainian authorities must announce the date of presidential and parliamentary elections, due to take place no later than 100 days after the lifting of martial law. The peace treaty between Russia and Ukraine shall be approved by a legally binding resolution of the UN Security Council. Okay, so that's the documents. Now, the consensus obviously has been over the last 48 hours that, oh, well, this is a non-starter. They both essentially, both Russia and Ukraine have presented their wish list, and there's no meeting ground, and that's probably true. I mean, I'm not at all being optimistic here. However, if the if the U.S. president were to throw his weight in and declare that we can work on a 30-day ceasefire, and when during that 30-day ceasefire, we will not provide arms and intelligence to Ukraine, and Ukraine, there's to be no foreign forces are going to be placed on the territory of Ukraine, and moves are made toward some kind of a serious agreement toward the resolution of this war. It could be done, but Trump would have to really throw his weight behind this, and he would have to say, "Look, I mean that." He was ready to do this in the early days of the administration. The early days of the administration, he was prepared to cut Ukraine off. So he's going to have to say, "Yeah, I'm cutting Ukraine off because a ceasefire is in everyone's interest, and that's the only option for a ceasefire. The alternative to get a ceasefire is for Ukraine to withdraw from the 4 oblasts that Russia claims as now parts of the Russian Federation. That's much harder for Ukraine to accept. Ukraine's unlikely to accept that. So in lieu of that, then you say, okay, well, let's see if we can agree on a 30-day ceasefire, only involving no further arms, intelligence, no mobilization, no movement of forces during that that period. And then that could be at least some basis to move the negotiations forward. Now, for that to happen, Trump would obviously have to seriously engage in these negotiations, as he hasn't done it. I'll be honest, he hasn't done it. He sort of reacts, he tends to react from one thing to another, and then fails to react, as given what happened over the weekend. He didn't react. He fails to react over Lindsey Graham apparently taking over the running of U.S. foreign policy from him, sashaying his way around Europe and meeting all sorts of European leaders and promising them, hey, you want sanctions from Washington, you're going to get sanctions from Washington. I'm going to deliver sanctions for you. And they're all purring. Oh, nice. Oh, good to see you, Lindsey. So Trump has to get his hands around this, because otherwise nothing is going to happen. Because then we're just going to go back to the consensus view, the Biden, NATO, EU, Ursula von der Leyen, Keir Starmer consensus. Oh, we've got to continue to support Ukraine, continue to deliver arms for Ukraine, because that's the only way we're going to get Putin to the negotiating table. Even though that policy has been tried and tried for 3 years, and it's not going to work. And they know it's not going to work. And why are they pushing it? Because they want this war to continue. They know perfectly well, if you haven't got Putin to the negotiating table for 3 years, you're not going to get him now. They're not going to come, just, oh, well, the 18th sanction package, that's the one that's going to do it. That's it. That was the one Putin couldn't take. And it's not, not going to happen. And they know it's not going to happen. So this is just, all of this is just posturing, because they want the war to continue. Anyway, let's take a look at our locals board. These are the people, the our favorite people, who the people who, the gagglers, the members of our community, who ensure that the dogs are fed. The dogs are in more or less. I wouldn't say they're exactly in a good mood, because they're never really in a particularly good mood, but at least they're not in a foul mood. And that, I think, is that I think so. We really appreciate all of the gagglers, and all the support that they provide for the community, and above all for the support they provide for the dogs. So first off the bat is Shopronka. It's good to see you again, Shopronka. Kedves Gyuri, ha szabad. Okay, yeah, yes, szabad. Köszönöm. And Skippy, Apple, Peter, and you are my lifesavers. Oh, that's very nice. But the only problem I have with that is that the dogs don't really like sharing the limelight with anyone. So the dogs insist they're the ones who are doing the heavy lifting. So they, Peter, George, they can go, whatever. But they're the ones who are doing all the heavy lifting. So that, they won't be flattered by this, but I am. Thank you. And Chopronka goes on, living in the UK, I have to tear my hair out every day with all the bilge about the threat to our security from Russia. Yes, it's very interesting, because you had your Prime Minister, Sakir, talking yesterday. He's brought in his new defense package. No idea how that's going to be paid for, but massive rearmament that he's promising. There's no money. There's no money for any of this. But he's dressing this up as necessitated by the threat from Russia, and it's all completely made up, and it's entirely fictional. But you can do this because the media are only too happy to play along with this nonsense, that somehow there's this threat from Russia to the UK. What exactly is Russia going to do? I mean, is there a plan to invade the British Isles? I mean, they're going to lob missiles into London. It's nonsensical. Well, the media just love this, and they're constantly whipping up hysteria, and have been now for years, whipping up hysteria about Russia. And now we've got this Starmer package, and no idea where the money is going to come from. I mean, I imagine it's just going to be by borrowing. So it's just basically financing it through debt. And what you said about the British is right. I'm not living there now, but I get a feeling for it whenever I watch CNN, which is full of Brits. They always have just these Brits speaking there, and they just regurgitate all of that hysteria about Russia. And I mean, we just had these examples that they say, oh, Russians have absolutely refused a ceasefire. He said that is simply untrue. They're absolutely untrue that Russia has rejected a 30-day ceasefire. But, because never, not once, throughout the British media, does anyone present the position of Russia. Not necessarily favorably. You don't have to present the Russian position favorably. You don't have to defend it. You don't have to support it. But at least tell us what it is the Russian position is, rather than, oh, they're obviously evil. Obviously, they just want to destroy others. Obviously, they want to conquer, after Ukraine, Britain. Then that's the this fantasy that they peddle. It's really a disgrace. I mean, it's just. I mean, I'm not saying the British media were ever very good. I mean, I'm not saying, oh, in my day, when I was a wee nipper, the British media were good. No, there was always crap. It was always, it was always shit. I mean, it really was. However, no matter how shitty it was back then, it's shittier now. The standard was low back then. but it's really low now. I mean, it's always, the worse always gets worse. So so yeah, it's I can imagine that you feel terrible and that you're tearing your hair out. So Russia, while all the time Israel rampages through West Asia, yes, commits genocide in Gaza, yes, all with Trump's and Starmer's blessing. What's always funny is that with this blessing is that there's always there comes a moment when Israel is a little embarrassing. And then when Israel is becoming a bit embarrassing, out come these platitudinous comments. And we discussed it, I think, last week or maybe the week before, when the British, the Canadians, and was it the French? Yeah, and the French, they issued that statement criticizing Israel, saying something like, Israel could be on the verge of violating international humanitarian law. Could be on the verge. In other words, Israel is still adhering to international humanitarian law. But there's always a moment when it's so embarrassing. I mean, the scenes on television, the scenes on the internet are just so embarrassing that these politicians have to say something pro forma, to avoid the stench of Israel's actions attaching to them. So yeah. Anyway, Shopronka, thank you very much. We appreciate your comment. Robert Chow from New Jersey, with a cold spell, has finally given way to a sunny 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It's so nice, that somebody is still using Fahrenheit. I grew up using Fahrenheit, and then I had to make the switch to Celsius, and I've never really been able to switch over. It just doesn't mean anything to me. Celsius means nothing to me. You tell me, oh, this is the temperature. I have no idea what it is until I convert it to Fahrenheit, and then I know what that means. Same with kilos and pounds. I have no idea what a kilo is until I can convert. Oh, I know what that is in pounds. Then I can make a sense of what it is. So glad it's warmer. It's got warmer here in Budapest, though the sun, you're not getting too much sun at the moment. So, but still, as I said at the beginning, we've got this really now. What is it? 2 weeks, 2 weeks during which the days are getting longer, and then boom, we go down the dangerous, horrible path of the shortening of the days. Anyway, Robert says George Galloway, in regard to the case of Keir Starmer and the 3 male models, hinted that arson could just as well be spelled another way, depending on what facts emerge. Huh. Yeah, I guess so. I think the whole story is very, very peculiar, and what I think is, instructive is what the commentators are not drawing attention to. I mean, it would be very interesting to ask Keir Starmer whether he knows any of these 3 male models. Has he ever met them? Does he know who they are? Maybe does he know anyone who's maybe a mutual friend of theirs? Does he have any sense of what could be the motive? Why would anyone go after his previous properties? Properties he lived in many years ago. How did these people know about it? And why would male models? You would think, I mean, that they have other things on their minds. I mean, why would they bother to set fire to properties that Starmer no longer lives there? I mean, like the car that was set on fire. It used to be Starmer's car, but he sold it. So what's the point of setting fire to a car that Starmer no longer owns. So, but I think that's very instructive. That nobody really asks Starmer, "Do you know any of these three? Have you ever met them? Do you know anyone who might have met them?" But the good manners of the media, they don't ask such questions. Anyway, so thank you, Robert. Judy Hotchkiss, always very good to see you. Thank you as always for your really interesting and fascinating observations. Always very very probing and insightful. So thank you, and of course thank you for your generosity. And then Judy says, "Here is what Grok tells me about why the Russian nuclear bombers were out in the open." Okay, first off, the New START treaty doesn't explicitly say bombers have to be parked out in the open. No, that's exactly right. That's what I was saying. But the verification process does rely heavily on satellite imagery. Yes, the verification that the numbers are being adhered to. So the verification, if bombers have to be dismantled, or a nuclear capable bomber is being converted into a bomber that is no longer nuclear capable. That's the part that has to be verified. Um, or when you dismantle the aircraft, that you dismantle the launchers, that you have to provide the evidence of the dismantlement. But they're not just out in the open so that they can that everyone can see them. Anyway, so yeah, absolutely, the verification process does relate. So while it's not a direct requirement, keeping them visible makes sense for compliance checks. It's like saying, "Hey, here's what we've got count away." The treaty is all about transparency. Yes, it is transparency about the requirements of what you're doing. So it's about whether you're adhering to the numbers, or you're adhering to the dismantlement. But by using any common sense, they're not out in the open. I mean, if planes require service, maintenance, they're required for training, whatever, they're not going to be out in the open. If they need to be protected from the weather, they're not going to be out in the open. So then it's not a requirement that they be out in the open. The issue is what needs verification. That's all that is required. You have to whatever needs the requirements of the New START treaty. What has to be dismantled, whatever. That's what the satellites are supposed to monitor. But the other thing is that, well, Russia left the New START treaty. It said that it would adhere to the limits set by the New START treaty, but it would no longer participate. By that, it would no longer participate in the whole inspections regime. And that would mean on-site inspections or satellite inspections. And that's what it means. So it was very strange because after that, after Russia announced that it would no longer participate in the New START treaty, the Americans said, "Okay, well, if you're not participating, we're not going to participate." In other words, Russia no longer had access to American strategic weaponry. They could no longer monitor it. So I mean, if you're going to make a grand announcement and enjoy the bad publicity that you got because Russia was immediately attacked for announcing that it would no longer participate in the New START treaty. So if you're going to go there, you take all the brickbats that come your way from making this announcement. "Oh, Putin, nuclear saber rattler Putin." So you're going to get that, and then you're still adhering to it. I mean, it makes makes little sense. Anyway, Judy, as always, thank you so much. That's and I agree with your point. And then Robert says, "Thank you." Thank you, Robert, of your generosity. It says the New York legislature just approved $10 million in taxpayer funds to cover private legal bills for state employees under federal investigation. Oh, that's nice. Um, and then, AKA the Letitia Big Tish James Mortgage Fraud Defense Fund. Ah, yes. This follows their earlier stunt of passing a retroactive law so E. Jean Carroll could sue Trump for an alleged assault she can't even date. I was wondering if there are any bills in the EU rising to that level of brazenness. That's a very interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to look into that. But you're absolutely right. So, I mean, the E. Jean Carroll case, and we talked about this before, but that they changed the law because she was bringing up an alleged event from the mid 1990s. And she brought this up when she wrote the book in 2019. So this is 2020. So that would have been 25 years earlier. Obviously, the statute of limitations for making any of these allegations um, against Trump, had long passed. So they had to change the law, and they did it specifically for this one person. It was not, oh well, let's change it because of Me Too or anything. It had nothing to do with Me Too. It was specifically tied to the allegations of E. Jean Carroll, and this was taken up by that horrible creature, Kellyanne Conway's husband, George Conway, who was filled with this resentment against Trump because he was expecting Trump to give him some big job in the Justice Department. He didn't get that, and then he just went off on this crazy campaign against Trump. But it was Conway, he got together with Jean Carroll, and they persuaded the New York legislature to pass this law, which is a one-off. It was a kind of a one-off, with the sunset provisions that that it wouldn't apply, beyond this one case. And that's how she was able to sue Trump over something that she couldn't even remember the exact date. Now, in this case, with Big Tish James, I mean, there's so much fraudulence in her case. I mean, we've got the mortgage fraud, her claiming that this house in Virginia that she bought is to be her primary residence. She's the New York Attorney General. How can your primary residence be in Virginia? And then you have the whole thing in Brooklyn. This house that she claimed had fewer units, in order to get the tax break. And then there's another one, and that's one I'm a little hazy about, where she claimed that she was married to her father or something like that she put in her applications, that her father was her husband. I think, Robert, you probably have a clear idea of that right now than I, but there's somewhere where she made this claim about that her father was her husband. So she's utterly corrupt. The one thing that worries me is I don't have any real faith in the Justice Department of Pam Bondi. So these cases against Big Tish look quite compelling, but I don't see any action coming from Pam Bondi. Very quick. She's very quick when it comes to anti-Semitism. All manifestations of anti-Semitism, she's off the mark on that issue, but on nothing else. I mean, there has been nothing. And I have to then bring up the case of James Comey. Now, he made a direct threat at the president. Now, maybe that the Comey would be acquitted. That's possible. He might beat the rap. But what does it matter? Make him pay the price. Impose a cost on him. And have him, get him hauled into a prison, get his mugshot, get him into court. He has to hire a lawyer. He has court dates. He has to go through this, spend a huge amount of money on his defense. Go, yeah, let's do that. Go do all that process because Comey deserves it. Comey did this to others. Comey imposed all of that on so many other people. So let him get a taste of his medicine, even if he might beat the rap at the end. And Pam Bondi should be able to find a jurisdiction that is a little more favorable to the DOJ than DC. Yeah, DC, the Comey would probably move to get the case thrown out, and then one of these awful DC judges would agree to having Comey throw the case out. So there must be jurisdictions in the country that might be more favorably inclined towards the DOJ case against Comey. But she hasn't done anything about this. I mean, if it's been anyone else, if this were the other way around, and some prominent figure in MAGA had done this, let's say Marjorie Taylor Greene had said 86, 46, let's say Biden 46, and she had done that, Marjorie Taylor Greene would already be hauled before a judge, and she would already be in urgent consultations with her attorney, and facing very steep legal bills to try to seek an acquittal. So the fact that Bondi hasn't done any of this, it landed in her lap. Comey is such a disgusting, filthy, vile human being, if you can call him that. He's made life so miserable for so many people, and he's such a self-righteous, sanctimonious prick. And he's got away with everything so far. And here this lands in your lap, and you haven't done anything? And when are you going to get the next chance to do something like that? And then after you've done this, there's other things that you can try and get Comey on. But this is, absolutely, it's in your lap. You need to do something about it. Again, she hasn't done it. That's why I'm having more and more doubts whether Bondi is even going to do anything about Letitia Big Tish. Marty, always very good to see you. What are we looking at here? So what Marty is showing here, this picture that he's posted, this is Annalena Baerbock, who has just been elected president of the UN General Assembly, which doesn't seem like much, but it's a very well-paying job. And I doubt whether you have to do an awful lot of work. I mean, I would imagine, you're president, it's not like you're going to have to be there for every meeting of the UN General Assembly. I mean, you show up, once or twice, and then you have your underlings take your place at other times. But this picture that Marty has posted, that's Annalena Baerbock doing a handstand in a television studio. If you see the footage itself, it's not particularly impressive. I mean, the picture is more flattering than the reality, because handstands are difficult if you can hold that pose. That's doing it, but just doing a handstand and then you fall over, that's not that difficult. A lot of people can do that. But the picture is very flattering because it suggests that she was able to do the handstand and hold the position, which she didn't. So if you just watch the footage, she's not able to hold the handstand. So it's not particularly impressive. But I guess, now that she's got this gig, president of the UN General Assembly, paid a very nice sum of money, incidentally, then she can, prepare for her next gig, next nice paying gig, just like Kaja Kallas, after her disastrous stint as Estonia Prime Minister. Hey, I get another gig. I get to be the EU Foreign Minister. Anyway, so anyway, Marty, thank you so much as always for all of your interesting posts. In Annalena Baerbock on the handstand. So thank you. Judy continues. It says from TASS, President Donald Trump was not notified by Kiev about his plans to attack Russian airfields. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said he was not. She told reporters in a corresponding question when asked about the U.S. administration's position on Kiev's attacks on Russian airfield, she said that she would prefer the president to express it. Well, I actually do think that he wasn't notified. I really do. Now, that doesn't mean that the United States was not involved. I think the United States was unquestionably involved in this attack. However, I think the United States, whenever it's engaged in very dodgy, dangerous, covert activities, it doesn't disclose what it plans to do to the president. For one thing, it's a very dangerous thing, and so if the president gets to hear about it, he'll say, "No, I don't think it's a very good idea. I don't think we should do this. This is very risky." So Trump, if they told Trump about it beforehand, Trump would almost certainly have said no, which is why they probably didn't inform Trump. But there's also the issue of the plausible deniability. I mean, if you're doing a covert operation, you really don't want the president signing off on it because it might be embarrassing for him later, because then he has to explain himself to the public, he has to explain himself to the rest of the world, and it doesn't look good. So either, yeah, I signed off on it, and it was a bloody stupid thing and a very dangerous thing, or they didn't tell me about it, or they didn't bother telling me about it, which means I look rather stupid. Remember, JFK signed off on the Bay of Pigs invasion. And of course, then he admitted that he had signed off on it, and then everybody had a go at him, and it was America looked weak and feeble, and he went to the Vienna summit with Khrushchev, and Khrushchev was, of course, had a great time of it, berating Kennedy. You're invading the sovereign country and whatever, and Kennedy was just very sheepish. That's what happens. That's why you don't really want to tell the president, because then he's stuck with it. Either he'll say no, in which case you have to accept his no, or you defy him. That's a bad look if you go ahead and you're insubordinate and don't follow the president's instruction, or you basically makes the president look feeble. So that's why I think presidents are usually just kept out of the loop when there's anything dirty and messy to be done. And we talked about it the other day. I mean, the Iran-Contra was the classic case. They knew that selling arms to the Ayatollahs in Tehran was a violation of U.S. law. Not supposed to sell arms to Iran. And they knew that transferring the funds from the sale to the Contras was very awkward. Whether it was against the law, it was up in the air. Whether violating the Boland Amendment was actually a violation of law. It's a complicated issue. But either way, it was a very tricky, embarrassing operation, and so they didn't tell Reagan about it. And this was Admiral John Poindexter, who was the national security advisor at the time. He said during his testimony before the joint committees on Iran-Contra, he said, "Well, we didn't tell the president." Why didn't you tell the president? Well, because of plausible deniability. I think it's not good for the president to know this, and either he admits to it or he has to lie about it. Either way, it's not a good look for the president. Whether he admits to doing something that's dubious legality or he lies about it, and then it's also very bad. And it made sense because that's what saved Reagan from impeachment. If he had been told that the members of his staff were engaging in illegal activities, illegal covert activities, and he had known about it and he had signed off on it, he would have been impeached. He would have probably survived the trial, but he would have been impeached. So Poindexter said, no, we didn't tell him. We didn't want to put him in an embarrassing position. So anyway, what Caroline Levitt said, I absolutely believe. Believe that Trump did not know. What I think Trump should now do is he should absolutely get all of his intelligence chiefs into the Oval Office and the Pentagon chiefs, get them all into the Oval Office and say, what the hell is going on here? Which clown signed off on this? Which clown started playing these dangerous games that could lead us to a war between Russia and the United States? This is dangerous stuff. And you didn't tell me about it? Who signed off on this? Who agreed to this? So all of them. Get Hexeth in there. And then Tulsi Gabbard. Stop all this interviewing with Tucker Carlson. What did Tulsi Gabbard know about this? She's supposed to be running all of the intelligence agencies of the U.S. government. Well, what does she know about all of this? So everyone, he should do this now. It's done. It's spilt milk. I don't think he was told about it. But now he has to get his hands around it to make sure that it never happens again. Because this is dangerous stuff. And he has to tell Zelensky, don't ever pull a stunt like this again. So Trump has to do that. Because otherwise, they are absolutely going to pull this stunt again. Absolutely, they're going to do it. If he just simply says nothing, and he doesn't get all of his intelligence chiefs, all of his Pentagon chiefs, all of them in the room, and ask every single one of them who knew about this, who actually gave the go-ahead. But just simply saying nothing, I mean, that's not acceptable. Judy says, Zelensky said that the operation was planned 18 months beforehand. Obviously, the original targeting data about the airfields was provided by Biden. I agree, assuming Zelensky is telling the truth, but let's assume he is telling the truth. And that originally it was planned under Biden. However, somebody had to have signed off on this. I mean, somebody had to have agreed to go ahead and do this. But if somebody didn't, if this was entirely, there was no one in the U.S. government, this data was ever provided by the Biden people, and the go-ahead was given by the Biden people, and if Zelensky just went ahead and did this, knowing that he's not exactly Trump's favorite person, and Zelensky just did this without consulting anyone in the Trump administration, then he has behaved with the kind of recklessness that would justify absolutely just cutting him off from everything. And that would, dovetail nicely with the whole issue of this the rival peace deals, and the United States can just simply embrace the Russian peace plan, particularly the 30-day ceasefire plan presented by the Russians. That was if that is the case, that Zelensky just did this. He got the sign, the sign off from the Biden people, and then he just assumed that that's valid. What Biden's people agreed to is still valid for the Trump people. If that was his operating assumption, then he needs to be punished very severely. But saying nothing, just that isn't cutting it. There are all kinds of things. Trump can either haul in his team, find out if any of them agreed to this, or if none of them did, then he's got to tell Zelensky, well, that's it. We're not going to have a client who's going to push us into World War III. This is dangerous stuff. No American general, no Air Force general, no American president would ever have dared to attack Russian strategic aircraft. You've done it, and it's got Americans' fingerprints all over it. We're done. That's it. You're not worth the effort. So that he's got to do one or the other. Silence is just not acceptable. Anyway, as always, thank you so much, Judy. NKMRD, thank you for your generosity. And NKMRD says Baerbock was the most physical, profound foreign minister we ever had, perhaps. Nobody considered giving us an award for that, though. Most physical, profound. Well, I don't know what that means. I don't know what a physical, profound foreign minister. Yeah, I mean, I think when she won that vote, she won overwhelmingly to be president of the UN General Assembly. They declared, she was running this feminist foreign policy. As long as no one even knows what is a feminist foreign policy, you can say, yeah, I was running a feminist foreign policy. You're a warmonger, and therefore God only knows how many women and children are dead as a result of your policy. But you get to posture as pursuing a feminist. Yeah, I'm a feminist. It's a feminist foreign policy. Well, how many women are dead as a result of your feminist foreign policy? And anyway, thank you, NKMRD. And then NKMRD continues. Joschka Fischer. God, that's a name from the past. What a disgusting creature Joschka Fischer was. He was the green foreign minister in the German government headed by Gerhard Schröder, and he was the one who really pushed for, among others, but he was certainly an eager, enthusiastic, zealous bomber of Yugoslavia in 1999. Part of his humanitarian foreign policy. So just like Annalena Baerbock, that's a feminist foreign policy. Joschka Fischer bombing countries much smaller and weaker than you are is part of a humanitarian foreign policy. I'm bombing, for the sake of humanitarianism. Anyway, Joschka Fischer, with his sports shoes, still didn't look very athletic, even back in the day. And he was the very reason I turned away from the green forever. Where's he? Let's look this picture. Is this picture of Joschka Fischer? Oh, is that Joschka Fischer? It's a very young-looking Joschka Fischer, because I seem to remember Joschka Fischer as he was kind of white-haired. So here he still has dark hair. So it's a very youthful Joschka Fischer. And Robert says, in 7 days in May, General Scott plots a coup to stop peace. Yep, that's exactly right. And we had that. We had a screening of that in our Monday night screenings. I think you're absolutely right to ask, given the U.S.-backed attacks on Russia's bomber bases, whether this isn't exactly the same sort of soft coup the movie warned about. The question is whether this time Scott will pull it off. I absolutely couldn't put it better myself. And remember also, Scott had his allies in the Senate. You remember all those smarmy, hawkish senators who were always kind of ingratiating themselves with Scott. Always, General, you've got our support. You can always count on us. So you saw these Lindsey Graham types in 7 Days in May, and yeah, absolutely. You present the president with a fait accompli. Hey, well, we did this, and now we're in this a conflict with Russia, and and really, what the only reason we aren't in a more serious confrontation is that the Russians act in a very restrained, responsible manner. I don't think they should. I think that's a mistake, but nonetheless, they are restrained and they act responsibly, and they say, well, we can't really risk um, nuclear exchange and so on. So they don't act, in a way that would be appropriate. Now, these generals and these Lindsey Grahams, they want a war. They want a real serious exchange. Missiles, bombing. They want all of that, and so they'd be very happy if Russia were to respond in a way that I think would be appropriate. But that's exactly what they're trying to do. So it's a kind of combination of 7 Days in May and Dr. Strangelove. Remember in Dr. Strangelove, he launched this general, another crazy general, General Jack D. Ripper. He launches this nuclear attack on Russia, an unprovoked nuclear attack on Russia. The only objective of that was that, once he's done that, and the American president realizes, hey, the Russians are going to retaliate against us. They're going to retaliate against us with nuclear weapons. What am I going to do? Well, I better launch a preemptive attack on Russia. I better knock out everything that they have, because otherwise they're going to retaliate against us and kill I don't know how many millions of Americans. So it's kind of similar to this. Hey, Russians are bound to retaliate, and now, fantastic, we've got the war that we've always been longing for. So I don't know. You're right. Scott didn't pull it off, but you never know what's going to happen. We're dealing with really malevolent actors here. I mean, when you listen to some of these generals, these NATO generals, when they rant and rave about Russia, they come across often as more unhinged than General Scott was. Even General Scott seemed actually quite rational and humane in some ways in the film. These guys, these General Cavoli and of NATO and the one these NATO characters who pop up. I mean, they are really dangerous. Anyway, Stone River, as always, thank you so much for your generosity. And Stone River says, the more President Trump bleats, stop the fighting, stop the killing, the more impotent he appears. I agree, absolutely agree. Couldn't put it better myself. The obvious refrain, stop arming Ukraine. No, that's exactly right. That is exactly right. Because, up until last week, my view was that, okay, Trump, you can't really expect Trump immediately to cut off Ukraine from arms. It's a slow process. And cutting Ukraine off from arms, that's what you do once you've put forward your peace plan, you've got everyone negotiating, and you're moving towards some kind of an accord. Then, you hold that in reserve and say, okay, unless you play ball with us, unless you go ahead and accept our peace plan, we're going to cut you off. It's kind of what Nixon did to South Vietnam in 1972. Basically, look, I know you don't like this peace plan that we've got, that we're negotiating with Hanoi. You don't like it, but hey, we're the best you've got. And if you don't agree to it, we're just going to cut you off. And of course, South Vietnam did. So I thought that, well, Trump, we don't have to expect Trump to cut Ukraine off immediately, but that's something that you hold over Ukraine's head. That's your leverage over Ukraine. That at some point you say, look, here's our peace plan. This is what I think is we think is a reasonable deal. Either accept it, or we're cutting you off, and then you're going to have to rely on your friends in London, Paris, and Berlin to see if they're going to help you out. So that's why I gave Trump latitude. I wasn't one of the people who said, "Oh, Trump needs to cut Ukraine off right away." I didn't say, okay, he doesn't have to do it right now, but he has to hold that in reserve. But now, I kind of think that he's looking ridiculous. The events of the weekend made him look ridiculous. He starts spluttering and foaming at the mouth over Putin because Putin attacked Kiev. What do you care about Kiev? You're supposed to be America first. What the hell do you care about Kiev? But then you've got nothing to say over an attack on Russian strategic bombers, which obviously used American data for this attack. You don't have anything to say on that. I mean, it's that's not America first. Getting emotional? What's the matter with you? You're getting emotional about Kiev. What do you care about Kiev? So he gets emotional, and again, it's all phony and ridiculous because he doesn't get emotional about Gaza. That apparently he can live with. Suddenly he's getting emotional and starts denouncing Putin. After all, who's a major world leader. I mean, whatever you think of it, he's still president of Russia, describing in this way as if he's a nutcase. What kind of a language is that? Just and then now you don't have anything to say. So I think absolutely agree. He now looks kind of impotent. He looks like he doesn't have he has no idea what to do, and he's allowing Lindsey, loathsome Lindsey, to take over the running of foreign policy. Not a good look. And where are we? Yes. And then Vic Shakapopoulos says, "Dear George, what's your opinion of the Cyprus problem? What role did the Cold War politics play in it? Many accuse the U.S. of orchestrating either the 1974 coup or the subsequent Turkish invasion, or both. As a Greek, I feel that we ended in the worst of all possible worlds, no enosis, and the Turkish got what they wanted anyway." Well, that's a very good question. If one think about what happened in 1974, you remember the Archbishop Makarios was overthrown by these somewhat crazy Greeks, and they went ahead and declared enosis. Now, whether this was orchestrated by Athens, I'm not exactly sure. To what extent these were just nutters in Cyprus who did this. But either way, it provided Turkey with the excuse, which it obviously had been looking for, to mount an invasion of Cyprus, ostensibly to protect the Turkish Cypriots. Now, I'm not at all sure. Much as I want to think ill of the United States, I'm not at all sure that the United States was really watching this particularly. I mean, they didn't have a problem with the Greek colonels. But then, of course, Turkey wasn't exactly a democracy either. So neither Turkey nor Greece was a democracy. The leadership of Greece at the time had become very weak. The one clever character among the Greek colonels, George Papadopoulos. He had already been overthrown, and the guy who took over, Ioannidis, was kind of just he didn't have any of the intelligence, let's say, the intelligence and the smarts of Papadopoulos. So, um, so he, he may well have been involved in this overthrow of Makarios. It was a really stupid idea because Makarios, no one exactly liked him. But he was able to keep that island together. He was, he was acceptable to the Turks. He was acceptable to the Greeks. So he kept it together. But once he was ousted, it was just inevitable that the Turks were going to make their move. Now, but Turkey, of course, is much stronger than Greece, and ultimately, Turkey could easily defeat Greece in a war. Greece backed away. They talked big that they were going to ready to go to war with Turkey. Of course, Greece wasn't going to go to war with Turkey. The question then was, could anything have been done to push Turkey off the island? To reunite Cyprus? Probably. I guess most U.S. administrations just didn't want to antagonize Turkey. I'm not sure why that was. I guess they think Turkey is more strategically important than Greece, and so because you've got the Dardanelles, it's under the control of the Turks. You've got the Montreux Convention, that's under the control of the Turks. Turkey is very useful against the Russians. So I think U.S. administration decided, well, Turkey is more useful to us. It's stronger. Its geography is much more salient than that of Greece. So they didn't really do much about it. And so ultimately the status quo of a divided island, and however, I guess it's painful for Greeks, is okay, well, let's say, okay, then it's nothing terrible. I mean, it is outrageous. There's no question. It is outrageous because there was no real threat to the Turkish Cypriots. I mean, the idea of enosis obviously was stupid, but it was stupid because the reaction of Turkey could have been predicted. I mean, everyone knew exactly how Turkey would react in the claim of enosis. So it was a stupid thing to do. However, an invasion of the island was completely disproportionate because Makarios was restored to power almost immediately. I mean, it was clear that this was a huge blunder. So Makarios was restored. So in other words, we're back to the status quo ante. But Turkey continued with its invasion and occupation, and just took this chunk of the island. And it's now been more than 50 years, and nobody does anything about it. And by what stretch of the imagination is what Turkey did justified? I mean, it's not like the Turkish Cypriots were persecuted or anything at all was done to them. They were not facing any threat at all. And even if they were for 48 hours facing some kind of a threat, Makarios was restored to power. So if that's the issue, you overthrow Makarios. Makarios was back. So there's no justification for what Turkey did. And Turkey's now been occupying for 50 years. No one is going to do anything about that. And I find the sanctimonious of the Turks just, insufferable. I mean, they just, I think I've told the story before how I used to get invited to TRT on one of their shows. and then they had me on, and these Turks, these awful Turks, were going on and on about Russia and Ukraine and so on, and I said, hey, Russia's case for going into Ukraine is exactly the same as Turkey's case for invading Cyprus. Turkey invaded Cyprus, claiming that the Turkish Cypriots were under threat and that he had to make this intervention to save them from terrible things. Now, I think the Ukrainians have the Russian speakers of Ukraine, I think, have a much stronger case than the Turkish Cypriots did. But they said, it's exactly the same. The argument's exactly the same, the one that Turkey used and the one that Russia's using. They went absolutely crazy. How dare I say anything like this? They never invited me on again. Not that I'm crying exactly, but that's anyway. That's my take on Cyprus. So unfortunately, I don't think much is going to happen about that. Greece feels strongly about it, but Greece is obviously just simply not strong enough to take on Turkey. Nobody in NATO land particularly wants to take on Turkey, so I guess nothing much is going to change. Anyway, Anne-Marie, always very good to see you. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Thank you as always for your generosity. And what should I have to say, Anne-Marie is our resident, distinguished musician, who's, we should feel flattered that we have someone of such a caliber among the Gagglers. So I really appreciate Anne-Marie's contributions, and particularly when she offers very insightful, knowledgeable commentary about music as someone who is an experienced professional performer, and that's we really benefit so much from that. So I'm very thankful. And Anne-Marie will soon be performing Wagner's The Ring, which is an amazing feat. And I hope Anne-Marie will provide us with some information about where these performances take place, and so on. So maybe some of us, will be in the vicinity and can see one of the operas of the Ring cycle. So that would be good. I will be seeing Die Meistersinger at the end of this month. So I'm kind of looking forward to that. So we should feature more of Wagner in the Gaggle Music Club. We've done some Wagner, but maybe we should feature just one of his great music dramas. It's a big task, but we should do it. Anyway, Anne-Marie, thank you so much, as always, for your generosity. And then NKMRD says, good evening. I missed half the show. I wish countries wouldn't do as much stuff, would make it easier to follow the events. Well, I think that's true. I mean, I think it's hard these days to keep up, particularly in Trump time. I mean, there's a lot going on, and it's very hard. All the different things up in the air. So, I have difficulties keeping up, and then I'm always kind of surprised. Hey, I didn't know anything about this. Nobody told me this thing was going on. So yeah, it's very, very hard. And then MKMRD says, summa summarum, that vast majority of people in Donbass and the other oblasts dislike the EU, and many EU countries in Kiev, NATO, etc. So I would consider resources to be a topic, but the separatism was a long process with a pre-story. It's not even 2014 when things suddenly started getting funky. No, all of that is true, and I think we look at the history of that. Nobody asked the people of the Donbass to be dumped into Ukraine. That was just done. It's like this is what the Soviet leaders used to do. You just make these decisions. Okay, well, you're going to be in this republic, and that's all there is to it. And shut up. Don't complain. So South Ossetia, okay, well, that's going to be part of Georgia. But what about North Ossetia? Well, North Ossetia will be part of Russia. And so the Donbass, hey, but that was always really the heart of Russia. And well, it's not now. It's part of Ukraine. Well, what about Crimea? That's was part of Russia. Oh, well, Crimea, we're going to make that part of Russia. These are all decisions um, taken by Soviet leaders, completely arbitrary. No one was ever consulted on any of these things. And these are the borders. These are the borders that the Western powers, in the name of democracy, human rights, kind of fight for. These sacrosanct borders, which have no validity whatsoever, other than the arbitrary, capricious decisions of the Soviet leaders who made those decisions in order to screw over somebody. Now, chiefly the Soviet leaders made those decisions in order to screw over the Russian people. They always thought the Russian people, well, they disliked the Russians, the greater chauvinist Russia, as Lenin dubbed it. And so these were these decisions. Crimea. What was the logic of just suddenly deciding Crimea is going to be a part of Ukraine? I mean, no one was consulted on this, and this is what NATO wants to go and fight for. This is the hill NATO wants to die on, to insist on the territories and peoples who were never consulted on anything were dumped in one country when they wanted to be a part of another. Same thing happened, of course, in Yugoslavia. It's like, well, these are going to be the international frontiers. Yeah, but no one ever decided on what these frontiers are going to be, other than the communist leaders. Since when are you such great fans of the communists that somehow the decisions of the communists become sacrosanct? That we can't alter them. That they become unchangeable, immutable borders that communist apparatchiks drew up. And then Summer Petros. So always good to see you. Thank you so much, Summer Petros. And says, I'm shocked by your analysis, but fear it is correct. Yeah, my analysis is shocking. I think it is correct, sadly. But thank you so much, Summer Petros. But anyway, my time is up. Thank you so much, everybody who joined me. Thank you so much for your really interesting observations and questions and comments. And above all, thank you for the people who contributed to the tip jar. It makes our work, possible, makes it pleasurable. And just forget the dogs. I mean, they're not very nice. They're mean and nasty, and they demanding. So I express my thanks. They won't do it, but I will express my thanks on behalf of the Gaggle and on behalf of the dogs. So thank you so much. We will be back next on Thursday, so in 2 days' time. Thank you. Hope to see you all then. Until then, goodbye. Good night. Good night. See you then. Bye-bye.